Welcome to our deep dive into atomic habits. You shared a chapter with us, and we're really excited to break down what's most important, for you.
It's way more than just a to-do list hack.
Right.
This book is really all about building the person that you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just packed with insights about habits.
Absolutely. It all starts with this idea of the plateau of latent potential, right? Where you're putting in the work, but it feels like nothing is happening.
Yeah. It's like, think of an ice cube.
Okay.
You heat it up, but it doesn't melt until it hits a certain temperature. Right. Same with habits. All that initial effort is like building a foundation. Then boom, you have a breakthrough.
I like that. And the book really stresses that you don't need to drastically change your life overnight to see meaningful change. It's more about those small habits that we practice consistently.
And it's fascinating how these small actions can actually change how we see ourselves. It's like each time you do something, it's like casting a vote for the type of person you want to become.
So, if I'm trying to be a runner, each run is a vote for runner identity, even if it's just around the block.
Exactly. And as you cast more and more votes, that identity becomes more real. So it's not just about checking off a dox, but it's about the action becoming part of who you are.
Okay, so we're casting votes for our future selves. But how do these habits actually form? The book lays out these 4 stages of every habit, this cycle of cue, craving, response, and reward.
And this cycle applies to everything that we do habitually,
Yeah.
from brushing our teeth to scrolling on our phones. Think of a green traffic light.
Okay.
The green light is the cue.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
It triggers the craving to move forward.
Right.
Then comes the response. You step on the gas. Yeah. And then the reward is getting closer to your destination.
I never thought about a traffic light like that. But it really does make you realize how many habits we have, both big and small, as we're breaking down this traffic light example. Think about a habit in your own life. Can you identify the cue, the craving, the response, and the reward that keeps that cycle going?
And habits thrive on that anticipation of reward.
Right.
The book talks about how you can use this to your advantage, but it also explains why bad habits are so hard to resist.
Yeah. Speaking of irresistible habits, the book has this crazy example about mice and dopamine. Researchers gave them dopamine hits every time they poked their noses in this box.
Yeah. And those mice ended up poking that box 800 times an hour.
Oh my gosh.
Talk about craving a reward.
That's incredible, but it's also kind of scary how easily we can get hooked on those dopamine loops. It makes me think about those endless scroll sessions on social media.
Right.
But I wonder if there's a difference between that quick fix dopamine and the deeper satisfaction of reaching a long-term goal.
Yeah, there probably is. But the book gives us some strategies for working with our dopamine-driven brains, and one of those is temptation bundling. So that's linking something you need to do with something that you want to do.
Oh, so like rewarding myself with chocolate after a workout?
That's one way to do it. Or let's say you need to make some work calls, but you really want to watch your favorite show. Make those calls right before you allow yourself to watch.
I can see how that would make those calls a little less dreadful.
Right.
Okay, so we talked about how habits form and the power of reward. Now let's shift gears to the role of our environment. The book stresses how much our surroundings actually influence our habits.
Yeah, and it makes sense why it's easier to build new habits in new environments because you're away from those familiar cues and temptations that trigger your old habits.
The book shared that incredible story about Vietnam War veterans where 90% of those addicted to heroin quit almost overnight when they came home.
And that was the change in environment. Fewer triggers meant that they were much less likely to fall back into old patterns.
That's wild. Thinking about that story, it really makes you wonder what triggers we have in our own lives. What are the environmental cues that are making it harder for us to stick to our good habits or making us fall back into our bad ones?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's about taking an honest look at our surroundings and seeing, how we can tweak them.
Yeah.
Can make the good stuff easier and the bad stuff harder.
So if I'm constantly surrounded by junk food, it's going to be way harder to resist.
Yeah. But if you make healthy snacks more visible and accessible, you're more likely to reach for those instead.
Out of sight, out of mind. It's interesting to think about how even small changes to our environment can have a big impact on our habits.
Absolutely. And that's something that we can all control, regardless of our circumstances.
Let's debunk a popular myth while we're at it. Those 21 days to form a habit promises. Forget about it. The book really emphasizes that it's about repetition, not perfection. The more you do something, the more ingrained it becomes.
Remember that phrase, Neurons that fire together wire together.
Oh, yeah.
That's Hebb's law, and it really highlights why repetition is key to strengthening those neural pathways.
So it's more about consistency over a long period rather than trying to be perfect for a short burst.
Exactly. And don't get bogged down trying to be perfect. Just focus on getting those reps in.
You know what makes getting those reps in even easier? Reducing friction, which is a big part of the book. Make it as easy as possible to do the good habits.
Yeah.
Like that example about placing your workout clothes right by your bed.
Exactly. It's about making it as effortless as possible to get started. And that tiny bit of friction removed can make a big difference.
It's like setting yourself up for success before you even wake up.
Right.
We can flip that on its head too, right? Make those bad habits harder.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about deleting those distracting apps, unsubscribing from those tempting emails, or even rearranging your physical space to make those bad habits less accessible.
Yeah. Speaking of making things difficult, the book mentions this intriguing concept called a commitment device.
Yeah, that's a strategy where you make a choice in the present that controls your actions in the future, like binding yourself to those good habits and restricting those bad ones. And the book had a great example about James Clear and his social media addiction.
Oh, yeah. He had his assistant reset his social media passwords every Monday, so he couldn't access them during the week.
Yeah, it was a really clever way to kind of break that cycle of mindless scrolling.
That's so smart. I love that he actually put that into practice. It shows how committed he was to breaking that habit. I wonder if there are other areas of life where that kind of commitment device could be helpful.
Oh, definitely. Like, let's say you wanted to get serious about saving money. You could set up an automatic transfer to your savings account every payday.
So instead of relying on willpower to save each month, I'm basically automating that good habit.
Exactly. Or if you want to be more physically active, you could sign up for a fitness class or join a running group.
That way, I'm not only committing to the activity, but I'm also surrounding myself with people who have similar goals. Which reminds me, the book talked about the power of social influence.
Yeah.
We're so influenced by the habits of those around us.
It's true. We tend to imitate the habits of, our family, our friends, our colleagues, those in our close circle.
Which means that if I'm trying to eat healthier, but everyone around me is constantly ordering takeout, it's going to be much harder to resist temptation.
That's why the book emphasizes the importance of surrounding yourself with people who have the habits that you want to develop.
So it's not just about willpower. It's about tapping into the power of our social networks.
Right. Now, thinking beyond our immediate circle, the book also points out that we're influenced by the habits of the larger groups that we belong to. The many, as the book calls them.
Our tribe, our community. We want to fit in and conform to the social norms of the group. It reminds me of that famous experiment where people were shown lines of different lengths and asked to match them.
The Ash conformity experiments.
Yes. And it turned out that people were much more likely to conform to the group's incorrect answer than to trust their own judgment, just because they didn't want to stand out.
It's incredible how powerful that social pressure can be, even when we know the group is wrong.
So if I'm trying to start a meditation practice, but none of my friends or family meditate, it's going to feel a lot harder than if I joined a meditation group where that's the norm.
Exactly. It's much easier to stick to a habit when it's already ingrained in the culture of the group. And then there's the influence of those in positions of power. The powerful.
Okay.
Think about how much more likely we are to follow the advice of a doctor or a successful entrepreneur.
It's like we see them as having a shortcut to success or knowledge that we don't have yet.
And that can be a powerful motivator. We naturally look to those that we admire and try to emulate their habits, hoping to achieve similar results.
But we have to be careful, right? Not every influencer or authority figure has our best interests at heart.
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to evaluate the source and make sure their advice aligns with our values and our goals.
Yeah.
Blindly following anyone, regardless of their status, can lead us down the wrong path.
Okay. So we've talked about the 4 stages of habit formation, the importance of reward and environment, and now the impact of social influence. Are we missing anything?
Well, the book doesn't explicitly address this. But your point about commitment devices made me think about something. While making those good habits easier is a fantastic starting point, we can't just automate our way to success.
That's a really good point. It's like we're building this incredible foundation, but at some point we need to step outside of our comfort zone and push ourselves further.
Exactly. And that's where this concept of deliberate practice comes in.
So this is where we go beyond those easy automatic actions.
Right.
And focus on really challenging ourselves to improve in specific areas.
Precisely. It's about stepping outside of that comfortable routine and seeking out those moments of discomfort.
Because those moments of discomfort are often where the real growth happens.
It's not always fun.
Right.
But it's essential for reaching those higher levels of mastery. Think about athletes who push their bodies to the limit, or musicians who spend hours practicing a difficult piece. They embrace those challenges, knowing that it's the path to improvement.
It's like the book's emphasis on reflecting on our identity. It's not just about doing the habits, but about becoming the person we want to be.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And to become that person, we need to be willing to push ourselves beyond our limits.
Yeah.
To ask ourselves, who do I want to be? What do I want to stand for?
It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and lose sight of that bigger picture. We can forget about the kind of person we're becoming in pursuit of just checking things off our to-do list. But taking the time to reflect on our values and aspirations can be incredibly grounding.
It can help us ensure that our habits are truly in alignment with who we want to be. It's an ongoing process, isn't it? As we grow and change, our ideal self might shift and evolve too.
It's about being open to that evolution and making sure that our habits evolve along with us. Okay, so deliberate practice is about pushing past our comfort zones. But earlier we talked about making good habits easier. I'm curious how those two ideas kind of work together.
They complement each other. Think of making good habits easy as building a strong foundation. It's about removing those initial barriers to action. But once those habits are more or less in place, that's where deliberate practice comes in. You start intentionally challenging yourself to take those habits to the next level.
So if I'm trying to write every day, I might start by making it easy. Setting up a dedicated writing space, scheduling writing time in my calendar, minimizing distractions. But once that becomes a habit, deliberate practice might involve working on a specific writing skill, like crafting better dialogue or tightening my prose.
Exactly. It's about pushing yourself beyond simply showing up and focusing on those targeted areas for improvement.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like leveling up my habits.
Now, going back to what we discussed earlier about the role of environment, remember the key is making those cues for good habits obvious and visible.
Yeah, out of sight, out of mind. If I want to drink more water, I'll keep my water bottle on my desk where I can see it.
Exactly. The book even mentioned that simply making energy usage more visible can lead to a decrease in energy consumption.
So people become more conscious of their habits when they can literally see the impact. Oh, and there was that example about the urinal flies. I can't believe how effective that was.
I know. Sometimes the simplest solutions can be the most ingenious.
So if I'm trying to read more, I could stack some books on my bedside table instead of keeping them tucked away on a shelf.
Precisely. Make those cues impossible to ignore.
Mm.
And of course, we also talked about increasing the friction for those bad habits.
Right, like deleting social media apps or rearranging my pantry to make those unhealthy snacks less accessible.
Sometimes it's helpful to think like an interior designer for your habits.
I like that.
Design your space in a way that supports your desired behaviors.
I like that analogy. Okay, so we're designing our environment for success. What about those moments when our willpower just falters?
Well, the book talks about this concept called a commitment device, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
It's about making a choice in the present that controls your actions in the future.
It's like that example with James Clear blocking his access to social media during the week.
Exactly. It's about proactively removing the option to engage in those undesired behaviors.
I'm trying to think of other examples. Let's say I have a bad habit of staying up late and scrolling on my phone. What kind of commitment device could I use?
You could try using a website blocker that restricts your access to certain sites after a certain time. Or you could physically move your phone out of your bedroom at night.
So I'm not even tempted to reach for it.
Exactly. And if you want to be more accountable, you could even ask a friend or family member to hold you to it.
That's a good idea. I wouldn't want to let them down. Okay, so we've talked about individual strategies. What about harnessing the power of social influence? We were discussing how we tend to adopt the habits of those around us.
Right, and the book delves into the different types of groups that influence our habits. The close, the many, and the powerful.
We talked about the close, our family, our friends, our colleagues, and then the many, the larger tribes or communities that we belong to.
Exactly. And finally, there's the influence of those in positions of authority or status. The powerful.
The doctors, the mentors, the successful entrepreneurs. We tend to pay attention to their habits, hoping to glean some wisdom or shortcuts to success.
It's like we're seeking a blueprint for how to achieve what they've achieved.
Which can be incredibly motivating. But again, it's about being discerning and making sure their advice resonates with our values and goals, not blindly following just because someone has a fancy title or a large following.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is crucial, regardless of who we're learning from. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's talk about another key principle. The importance of making habits satisfying.
I'm all ears. I think this is something a lot of us struggle with. How do we stay motivated when the rewards seem so far off in the future?
One strategy the book suggests is to create a visual measurement of your progress.
So we're not just waiting for that future payoff. We're actually creating a sense of accomplishment right now in the present moment.
Exactly. Think of it like, tracking your steps on a fitness tracker.
Right.
Each step gets you closer to your goal.
Right.
And you get that immediate feedback along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. And the book had that great example of the sales professional who moved paper clips from one jar to another for every sales call he made.
Right.
Just a simple way to visualize his progress.
And there's that classic story about Benjamin Franklin. He actually tracked his progress on 13 virtues using this little notebook.
Oh, wow.
And he would mark down every time that he slipped up on a virtue.
Oh, that's interesting. What a tangible way to hold himself accountable. I'm noticing a theme here, making the intangible tangible.
Yeah, but there's a balance, right?
Right.
The book cautions against getting too fixated on the numbers.
Okay.
And that's where this idea of Goodhart's law comes in.
Right. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Exactly.
It's like when people get obsessed with losing weight and they end up resorting to these unhealthy crash diets.
Right. It's crucial to use those measurements as a guide, not as the ultimate goal. Focus on why you're building those habits in the first place.
So tracking, yes, but with a mindful approach, which leads us perfectly to the final part of the book about finding your Goldilocks zone for habit formation.
Habits are more enjoyable and more sustainable when they challenge you just enough, but they don't overwhelm you.
So it's about hitting that sweet spot where you're pushing yourself, but you're not setting yourself up for failure.
The book uses the analogy of a tennis match.
Oh, okay.
If your opponent is way better than you get discouraged.
Right.
If they're way below your skill level, it's boring.
Right.
The real sweet spot is playing someone who's evenly matched. You have to work for the win, but you believe you can actually win.
So it's about finding that balance. Not too hard, not too easy.
Right.
Just those moments that keep you engaged and motivated.
And this Goldilocks zone is dynamic.
Yeah.
As you grow and as you become more skilled, what was once challenging might become easy.
So it's an ongoing process of kind of calibrating.
Right.
I might need to increase the challenge or scale back depending on how I'm feeling.
Self-awareness is key. Pay attention to your internal state. Are you feeling bored? Maybe it's time to up the ante. Are you feeling overwhelmed? Maybe dial it back a bit.
That's a great takeaway. This has been such a fascinating deep dive into atomic habits.
Yeah.
We've covered so much from those small actions that can shape our identity to the power of our environment and how to make habits both easier and more satisfying.
The book is full of practical strategies for building better habits and really understanding, the forces that drive our behavior.
Yeah, it's not about those overnight transformations. It's about making those small, consistent changes that add up to these extraordinary results.
And, the book leaves us with this really powerful reminder. We are all works in progress, constantly evolving. And our habits are the building blocks for the people that we want to become.
So if you're ready to start building a better version of yourself, Atomic Habits is the perfect guide.